Okay, I was going to go ahead and get started.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, my name is Tim DeForest. I am the circulation manager at the library at the Ringling College of Art, a little bit north of here. And I was asked to speak tonight on the World War II themed comics that DC and Marvel Comics published in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. These were comics that were favorites of mine as a kid, especially the DC comics, which had great stories and great art. We'll be talking about that more in depth in a few minutes. These comics were never bestsellers, but they sold steadily enough to keep them going for years. They had really long runs. And so what is it that made the World War II themed comics so popular? One reason, that's true of any war story, no matter where it's set at, is that they are inherently dramatic. It's about people trying to kill each other, you know, and so there's a lot of drama in that. No matter what the mission is, capture a hill, kidnap an enemy general, whatever it is, there's going to be inherent danger in what they're doing and therefore inherent drama if the story is well written. Also, World War II gave everybody a familiar setting. You automatically knew who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, so you didn't have to explain it to anyone. You didn't even have to explain a lot of detail. If the American troops in the story had to capture a particular farmhouse, you didn't have to explain the overall strategic reason for that. You just had to say that was their mission and that was enough to tell the story well. So you could jump right into a story without having to give a lot of exposition on what was going on. Also, there were good guys and bad guys. World War II's is usually referred to as a just war because we were fighting the Nazis. We eventually liberated the Nazi death camps. The Japanese had a militaristic society that was enslaving the people they were conquering. So although the Allies often did things themselves that were morally reprehensible, overall you had a situation where you had a clearly defined set of good guys and a clearly defined set of bad guys. So you had people you could root for. And along the way, both companies, both DC and Marvel, although mostly DC, who did more World War II oriented characters, would introduce us to a lot of strong characters, people, fictional characters, but people we would get to like and care about and understand and empathize with. So there were all these reasons that kept these comic books very popular over the years. When war comics became popular, Marvel Comics, at the time they were called DC Comics, or at the time they were called Atlas Comics, I'm sorry, had a few war-themed books, but it was mostly DC that dived in to do World War II themed books. They were, at first, they were anthology books. They did not have continuing characters. Every story was self-contained in of itself, and then the next story would move on to another set of characters and so on. There were advantages to this. It let them jump all around all over the place. You could do a story about the infantry, you could do a story about the Navy, you could do a story about guys on a bomber, and so on and so forth. You weren't tied into any one branch of the military or any one type of action. And they were fortunate at DC to have a number of good writers, although the overwhelming number of war-themed books published by DC in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were written by a writer named Robert Kanigher. He did write some superhero stuff, but his strength was writing good war stories. And they were also fortunate in that they had some of the best artists in the business. And you can see some samples of some really cool covers here. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, covers were an important selling point. There were no comic book specialty shops, and there were no stores you could go to and ask and make up a subscription list like you can in a comic book shop nowadays for them to pull aside the titles you want, and you would go into the front desk and just ask for them. Back then, you would pick your stuff off the newsstand. So a striking cover that drew your attention to that particular comic book was an important selling point. And the covers done by the DC war artists were really quite excellent. They're dramatic, they're eye-catching. In a sense, they tell a story all by themselves through that one single image. Now, the stories on the inside also had really good artists working for them. And a lot of them, in terms of plot, would often depend on a particular gimmick. Like here's an example from a comic book, GI Combat, published in 1959, written by Bob Kanigher and drawn by Ross Andrew, and the story was called The Window War. And what you had was a couple of infantrymen who you're shown before the war, window shopping on around the street, looking at the stores at stuff they couldn't afford to buy. And then they get drafted, they go over to France to fight, and every window they run over to there's somebody behind it trying to kill them. Even when they're out in the woods, they come up to a German pillbox with a window in it and a machine gunner trying to kill them. So it was just a simple little gimmick. As kids, they thought windows were an entryway into these wonderful toys and all the things that they wanted. Then when they got to be adults and soldiers, they discovered that behind every window they came to was a German who wanted to kill them. And it's not a thematically deep thing. It's just a gimmick in order to build the story around. But it worked because the artist was good. The sequence in this story where the two Americans are pinned down trying to load a rocket launcher so they could, while unable to even lift their heads up in order to blow up the German pillbox, was a really tense page or two of great comic book action. So they told their stories well, even when the stories depended on just a simple gimmick in order to have a plot to build the action around. Now, by 1959, the DC War books started to feature regular characters. And the first and the most successful and the most famous was Sgt Rock, who was introduced in 1959. Actually, there was a story written by a writer named Bob Haney about a Sergeant Rocky, who was kind of the prototype of this character. And then Bob Kanigher grabbed the character, and he and the artist Joe Kubert made him somebody really memorable. He was, on the surface, the ultimate tough non-com, the guy who keeps the other troops in line and makes sure they get their jobs done. But beneath that, there were moments where he was human, where he was terrified of dying, where he was terrified of the men he was responsible for getting killed. And there were all these little elements in it that made him a very human and relatable character. And over the first few years, they built up a supporting cast. Sgt Rock was in Easy Company. In real life, an infantry company had about 200 men and was commanded by usually a captain, and there were a number of other officers in it. In DC Comics, Easy Company seemed to be a very small unit, and there was almost never an officer there unless the particular plot of a story required one to be there. It was always Sgt Rock in charge. And his regular characters all had nicknames that usually gave you a quick insight into what sort of character they were supposed to be. So the big guy in front is Bulldozer. He's their big, strong guy. The bearded guy's named Wild Man. You find out his background was he was a history teacher before the war, but now he's just hates Nazis so much he just goes nuts in combat, and so on and so forth. So these were the guys that surrounded Rock, all with their own individual personalities, and gave the story a little more depth because it filled it with people that you would meet each month when you bought the new issue, and you get to care about them and like them. In addition to that, the artwork continued to be great. Most of the Sgt Rock stories early on were illustrated by an artist named Joe Kubert, whose art style had kind of a rawness to it that really gave it emotional impact when the story needed to have that. He was truly an excellent artist. And he's probably best remembered for his work on the war comics. He did do some important work with superheroes and some science fiction stuff. But when people who are familiar with his work think of him, they think of Sgt Rock books he illustrated, because he just had a knack for it. That one cover in the middle there, with Rock reflected in the plasma that's being fed into the wounded man, that's like one of the best covers ever. That's, once again, that has a lot of emotional impact to it, and it tells a story in its own right. Now, I do want to comment on the top left one. Those two characters are Wild Man and Jackie Johnson. And Bob Kanigher, when he created the character of Jackie Johnson, he deliberately ignored the fact that the Army was segregated at the time in order to get a black man into the company. And he didn't do that just for diversity's sake. This was during the Civil Rights era, and he wanted to write things about black-white relationships. This particular story, the plot's a little contrived. Wild Man's hands are wounded so he can't shoot a gun. Jackie is wounded and temporarily blinded, so you have the black guy and the white guy have to work together as one, with Wildman directing Jackie's fire as Jackie uses the machine gun. It's really contrived, but it was during the civil rights era where you probably needed to drop an anvil on people in order to make your moral point. And considering that it was a venue that still sold mostly to children at the time, it was really kind of impressive that they would take on something like equality of races and do stories about it. It wasn't something you saw very often in popular fiction at that time. Now, there was also no historical chronology to these stories. 1 month would be a story set in France, which means it would have to be set in 1944 or 45. The next month, you would get a story set in North Africa, which means it would have had to have taken place a couple of years before that. There was, Kanigher, when he wrote these stories, didn't care about chronology and he didn't care about setting. He would just put Easy Company in whatever place and time period he wanted to tell whatever story he wanted to do that month. So he didn't worry about historical continuity when he wrote those. And that was really a strength of the books, because if he came up with a great idea which would require a desert setting, so he would have to set it early in the war when we were fighting in North Africa, he didn't have to worry about the fact that last month he was doing a story set in a German village, which means it would have been during the end of the war. He would just plop them down there, tell whatever story he wanted. Another thing I will say about the DC books, war books, because this will be important when we get to Marvel, is that they had virtually no connection to DC's superhero universe. DC is the company that publishes Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and other well-known superheroes. But there was virtually never any mention of superheroes. In fact, I think there was never any mention of superheroes in the DC books. They were their own little war books. They were their own little self-contained universe, and they did not interact with the superheroes. There was a couple of stories in Batman comics where he would team up with an older Sgt Rock, and these were stories written in the early 70s, I think. So it would be an older Sgt Rock who was still a sergeant trading NATO troops in Europe. So, and then there was one Batman comic where, without explanation, they just put Batman back in World War II, having him do commando stuff, and he teamed up with Sgt Rock. Bob Kanigher was always against stories about Rock set after the war, because his view of Rock was he was the ultimate World War II soldier, and that Rock would have died with the last bullet fired just before the peace was signed. He didn't want Rock used in any other than a World War II setting, but he didn't actually own the character, so he had nothing to say about it. But very rarely was Sgt Rock used outside of the war books and interact with the DC superheroes. Now, these stories were mostly just action stories that worked because they were well written in terms of plot, they had characters we could relate to, and the artwork was almost always excellent. But they would occasionally deal with really deeper themes, and they would do so with just an extraordinary amount of sophistication and emotional impact. This is Our Army at War with Sgt Rock from 1970. Just on a brief side note, this is the first comic book I ever owned. I traded 3 little plastic astronauts to a guy named Scott, a kid named Scott on the school bus, to get a copy of this. And I read it and I was completely enthralled with it. And I just remember that night trying to relate the plot in detail to my siblings who were curiously completely uninterested in it. And it was like the first indication I had that I was more awesome than any of my brothers or sisters. But this story had Sgt Rock and some guys from Easy Company trapped in a bombed out house with the Germans trying to kill them, and they were fighting. It seemed to be hopeless, and they were fighting off attack after attack, and they were trying to think of a way to get out of this. And one guy, a guy named Smitty, is in a panic, and he's convinced that his cowardness is going to get everybody else killed. And what makes this interesting is that the guy is calling himself a coward, and he says, "I'm going to let you guys down. Just shoot me now so I don't panic at the wrong moment and get you killed." So he's claiming to be a coward, but he's also expressing a willingness to sacrifice his life rather than get his buddies killed. And it's actually, I don't think I caught that level of sophistication as a 9-year-old, but it's actually pretty awesome. And the story ends with Rock kind of talking him into calming down and being part of the unit, and they fight their way out of the house and live to fight another day. But it was really kind of a neat way to look at it, that kind of double meaning to the guy claiming to be a coward, but in demanding and begging Rock to shoot him rather than him getting everybody else killed. That was, he was willing to do the ultimate self-sacrifice. Now, a couple of years later, there were a couple of more stories that dealt with the theme of cowardness. This one, from 1972, had a soldier who panicked and ran off when the fighting started. And Rock follows him. They both get captured by the Germans. There's some shenanigans that go on. So when they escape, they're wearing German uniforms. That's why he's in a German uniform in the bottom thing. They get separated again. And when the young soldier who panicked gets back to Easy Company, he tries to tell them that he fought bravely and did his best, but Rock had gotten killed, and that's why Rock's not there. Then Rock shows up and just whacks the guy, then picks him up and gives him his gun back and says, "We got to go fight. You need to pull yourself together." So there was an idea that somebody acting cowardly does not mean that he's always a coward or that redemption isn't possible. There's also the idea that sometimes physical bravery, when it's your duty, is the proper moral choice, that you don't have the option of being a coward. The right thing to do is to act with courage. But it does not condemn someone for one moment of cowardness. It says it kind of deals with the idea that anybody can panic in a specific situation. Because a few months after that, they did another story where Rock is ordered to bring all his best sharpshooters to a specific location, and they don't know why yet. And on the way there, they're ambushed by Germans while they're sleeping in a farmhouse, and they're hit with grenades and a flamethrower. And all the Easy Company guys, who are normally like these brave soldiers, hard as a rock guy, they all start to panic. They're all this close to breaking and running. And Rock figures out a way to get them out of the house and circle around the Germans and take out the Germans. And they get to where they're going, and they discover that they've been picked to be a firing squad to execute 3 guys who ran under fire. And they don't know they're just like completely floored by this, because the night before, they all realized that they had come this close to running as well. And they don't want to have to be the firing squad to execute 3 guys who did the exact same thing that they almost did. It's once again, it explores the idea that anybody, no matter how well trained and how brave they normally are, can panic under the right situation, and that you can't condemn a person as being just nothing but a coward when that happens. And the way this story ends is just before the execution, some Germans launch a raid on the area, and the 3 guys who were executed, who were supposed to be executed, give their lives helping to fight off the Germans. So once again, you have that theme of redemption there as well. These guys may have acted like cowards once, but they weren't always cowards. They were able to pull themselves together and do the right thing up to the point where they gave their lives to do it. So all 3 of these issues, I don't think it was deliberate, but they almost make like this thematic view of cowardness and redemption and human nature that really has a lot of depth to it. Also, the art was superb. The art on all 3 of these issues was done by an artist named Russ Heath. Just as a subjective opinion, I think he's the best of the war artists. He just is, his equipment and weapons and all is all completely technically and historically accurate. He does great anatomy. He knows how to block out the scenes to show you what's going on and to get the appropriate amount of emotional impact to any one panel. He's just a superb visual storyteller. And he could also jump from showing completely over-the-top action to these really human moments, because these were comic books. No matter how human the characters seemed or how important the themes they were dealing with, the action was never that realistic. It was always very comic booky. And it was interesting how Russ Heath and Bob Kanigher as a writer could do this like thematic tightrope between being absurdly unrealistic in the action and still putting in these really human emotional moments. In this one, Rock's been temporarily transferred to the Pacific, so he's been fighting the Japanese, and on the way home, the bomber he's in gets shot down. He's the only one who can bail out. That's one of my favorite panels of all time, by the way. That's just great art. When he lands by parachute, the plane crashes nearby, and he desperately tries to get in to save the rest of the crew. In one panel I'm not showing here, he just mentions that he can hear them screaming, but he can't get to them through the flames. They all die. And it's just this really powerfully emotional sequence, leading up to the point where the next morning when he can get their bodies, he just digs a grave for each one and marks each grave. And then after that, after this really very human, very real moment, Rock essentially invents the hang glider out of wreckage of the bomber and his parachute, and uses that to dive bomb the Japanese anti-aircraft guns that shot the bomber down. So you have that juxtaposition of the just real human emotion with this absurd, completely unrealistic action sequence, which doesn't bother me at all, because Heath was such a great artist that he makes that action sequence look incredible, and you just accept it for what it is. Heath was also really good at choreographing the action so that you could always tell what was going on. And you could always follow the action. You always knew where the different characters in a fight scene were in relation to each other in terms of the geography they're in and all of that. This is from 1973. It is the character Jackie Johnson is being held prisoner in a German village. And some German deserters show up and start looting the place, and they kill an old man. So one of the German kids lets Jackie go because he's the only one there who can defend them against these deserters who have just gone completely rogue. And the whole fight scene, you got 2.5 pages of fight scenes where you can follow the action perfectly. You always know what's going on. You always know where Jackie is in relation to the Germans, and you can see the tactics he uses in order to win the fight. It's a superb example of how a comic book artist can choreograph action to make it exciting, make it relatively realistic, and make it so that we as the readers can follow along with the action with no problem. Now, Rock was only one of many World War II characters that DC introduced in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s. There's actually too many for me to even mention a lot of them without keeping you all here until 1 in the morning. But one of my other favorite ones was the Haunted Tank. That is a guy named Jeb Stuart who commands a Stuart tank, which was named after the Civil War general Jeb Stuart. And it turns out the tank is haunted by the Confederate General Jeb Stuart, who only Lieutenant Jeb Stuart can see. So his crew thinks he's nuts, but the advice he gets from the ghost is so good that he is always keeping them alive, so they just go with it. And that Russ Heath was often the usual artist on that book initially, and it just, once again, it was a silly premise combined with great storytelling, great visual storytelling, and then some surprisingly human moments along the way. Gunner and Sarge were 2 Marines in the Pacific. They had kind of an interesting dynamic. The Sarge was the grizzled veteran. Gunner was the young guy who wanted to be anywhere in the world except in the middle of a war, but he was really good at it. He was like an expert marksman with any sort of weapon, so Sarge was always grabbing him to take him on missions, whether he wanted to go or not. They'd often bring their dog Pooch with them. Captain Storm was kind of based a little bit on Captain Ahab. He commanded a PT boat, which was a patrol boat that was about 60 feet long that were used a lot in the Pacific fighting the Japanese, that got rammed by a submarine. His crew died and he lost his leg, and he eventually gets command of another PT boat, and he's always looking out for the submarine that sank his first boat. Though unlike Ahab, he wasn't completely nuts to the point of endangering his crew. He was actually a good commander that his men eventually came to respect. He just really wanted to get that one sub. Johnny Cloud was a Navajo who flies a P-51 Mustang fighter in Europe fighting the Germans. They did stories initially about him having to overcome the bigotry and the unit he was in. And he did so by just being a better pilot than everybody else, and eventually becomes commander of the squadron. Now, when these This set of characters here, when their own individual stories, individual series were canceled, Bob Kanneker was never one to leave a good character behind without using them again. They all just kind of teamed up by accident with the Haunted Tank in one issue to help complete a mission, and they became a commando unit called the Losers because things never ever went quite right with them no matter what. And they became the lead feature as a commando unit rather than in individual stories in the book Our Fighting Forces for about 7 or 8 years. And once again, did some really good stories. Now I have been stressing the stories that had a lot of thematic depth to it and a lot of human meaning, but the comics could just be over-the-top silly too, the war comics. The one on the left here from Star Spangled War Stories was the series that ran for several years in the late 60s called The War That Time Forgot. And there is an island in the Pacific where dinosaurs still live, and every month in this comic book, some poor soldiers or Marines would end up on that island, and they'd have to fight dinosaurs as well as the Japanese. And in one case, there was a soldier with his own experimental combat robot with him fighting the dinosaurs. There was no thematic depth to these at all. These existed primarily so the artist, Ross Andrew, could draw dinosaurs fighting World War II soldiers. And that by itself was just so epically cool that that series sold the comics books for 2 years running before they finally brought it to an end. And it existed just for that reason. It existed simply to bring us images like this. There were never any regular characters in the series. There was never any deep morals. There was never anything but dinosaurs fighting soldiers. And that by itself was enough to make it work. There's a part of me that thinks this is the greatest artistic achievement in the history of mankind. It's like War That Time Forgot, Sealing of the Sistine Chapel, Mona Lisa, in that order. This was just a wonderful series for what it was. And Weird War, which ran in the 70s, took war stories, usually World War II stories, though sometimes they would do another setting, and just put in a supernatural twist. There would be Nazi vampires, there would be zombies, there would be, one story had the Nazis make a guy invisible, and he would go out and do commando stuff till the Allies figured out how to catch him. There was one story where apparently the Nazis were bringing their guys back as zombies, but it turns out they were just really rebuilding them as robots. So they just did some bizarrely fun stories, usually with a twist at the end, the way a lot of horror stories do. And in any one issue of a war book, you would have the Sgt Rock story or the Haunted Tank story or whatever, and then there would be a 6 to 8 page backup story after that. And some of the best work they did in the war comics appeared in these backup stories. For instance, Sam Glasman, who did this bottom one, served in World War II aboard a destroyer called the USS Stevens. So he would do the series of stories as backup stories. One would appear every few months, which would be fictionalized versions of what he experienced on the Stevens during the war, or what he heard from other soldiers, other sailors, maybe on other ships, and he would just move that action to the Stevens and do that story. And he did drama, he did tragedy, he did comedy, he did all the things that could happen to somebody in a war zone in real life in these really neat 6-page stories. Some of the other examples I wanted to show you, that top one on the right was a story about a British unit in North Africa that was ordered to capture a particular airfield behind enemy lines just before a big attack. So they sneak behind enemy lines, they attack the airfield. It turns out to be harder than they thought, and he loses like a dozen of his men before they capture the airfield. And then the commanding general flies in and says, "Oh, sorry, we've canceled the advance. We don't need the airfield anymore." So it dealt with the senselessness of war. It dealt with bad decisions made by commanding officers that get people killed for no reason at all. And the other story up there was about Lancaster bombers. These were the big 4-engine bombers that the British used for nighttime bombing against the Germans. And the whole point of this story was that no matter how well trained you were, and no matter how good your airplane was, and no matter how well your crew worked together and how experienced they were, in the end, whether or not you lived or died was just complete dumb luck. So they dealt with the horrors of war. They dealt with the senselessness of war. Even if you were fighting a war for the right reasons, we're trying to stop the Nazis. Horrible stuff is going to happen, and there's no way to avoid that. A lot of the backup stories in the DC Comics dealt with that very vividly and very effectively. Now, over in Marvel, Marvel Comics didn't really get into the World War II stuff until the early 60s, in 1963 actually, when they introduced Sgt Fury and the Howling Commandos. Now, the way this came about was that Stan Lee, who was the major writer at Marvel, and Jack Kirby, who was their primary artist, were creating very successful superhero books. And they were doing this with a method that was different than other companies did. They would come up with a general plot idea, and then the artist would draw the story out, and then the writer would go back and add the dialogue afterwards. In other companies, the writer would write the complete script with all the dialogue, and the artist would work with this. So the Marvel method was something that gave the artist a lot more creative input into the creation of each individual story. And according to legend, and I do not know for sure if this is true, but I hope it is because it's just such a cool story. Stan Lee was talking with Marvel's publisher one day, and he said that the Marvel method worked so well that they could come up with a title that was the dumbest title they could possibly think of, and they could still make a commercially successful comic book about it. So they came up with Sgt Fury and the Howling Commandos, which actually I think kind of sounds cool, but they felt that was a dumb title. But it was Stan Lee the writer, Jack Kirby the artist, and it turned out to be incredibly successful. It had close to a 20-year run before it was finally canceled. And it was, Sgt Fury was the head of a commando group who were nicknamed the Howling Commandos, obviously. They had this diverse cast of characters. They made a point, once again, this was the early 60s, and they made a point of dealing with racial issues. So they had a Jewish member, they had a black guy on the team, who in the original publication of the first issue was colored white because the colorist just assumed the marks that he was supposed to be a black man must be a mistake. And so they could deal with racial issues. But mostly they just told stories where the action was probably even more over the top and unrealistic than it was in the DC comics. But they did it really well. They told fun stories. But they still had some depth to it. There was a member, one of the original members of the Howling Commandos, his name was Juniper, gets killed in an early issue. And he doesn't even get killed in a particularly overt, heroic way. He just happens to take a random bullet during a firefight. There was a character named Pamela Hawsley, a British woman that Fury falls in love with. And then one issue, he comes back from a mission, he finds out that she was killed in the Blitz, that the German bombs got her. And boom. So they dealt with the tragedy of war, even within context of the over-the-top action they were doing. This panel, by the way, was done by an artist named Dick Ayers, not Jack Kirby, as I have written up there. But they eventually introduced a German character as a member of the Howling Commandos, Erich Koning, who was a native-born German, but had decided the best way to serve his country was to get rid of the Nazis. And they did some really good stories when he first joined about whether or not he could really be trusted by the other guys, but then proved himself to be a loyal and good soldier. And he didn't consider himself a traitor to his country. He figured, if I got to get rid of Hitler or my country's going to cease to exist. That was the moral choice he made, and it was just, you know, a very sophisticated attitude. Now, the Marvel war stories were very overtly connected to their superhero universe. Captain America was one of their current successful superheroes. His backstory included serving in World War II, and then he was in suspended animation for a while, and then woke up in modern times, which is why he wasn't old. But he appeared as a guest star in one issue of the Howling Commandos, along with his teenage sidekick, Bucky. And you just kind of got to go with the idea that people think bringing a teenager into battle dressed in bright colors is a good idea. So, and you had other characters from their superhero universe. Two members of the Fantastic Four, their original backstories was, years before, when they didn't have superpowers, they served in World War II. And those characters would guest star in different issues. So they directly connected their war books to their superhero universe in a way that DC didn't. But it worked for them. And Fury was popular enough to where they eventually introduced him into their modern superhero universe. This was the 60s, so they didn't have to worry about him being too old. If he'd been in his 20s in World War II, he would have been in his 40s in the 60s, and if he kept in shape, he could still be beating up bad guys. He first popped up as a guest star in an issue of Fantastic Four, and because this was when the James Bond films were popular, they made him head of a spy organization and started doing spy stories with Nick Fury, head of an organization called S.H.I.E.L.D. Gave him an eye patch, which was years before they explained where that eye patch came from. You were just assuming at some point between World War II and now he was injured. But they did, and these were very James Bond inspired stories. And even if you go back to the Howling Commando stories set in World War II, they would often include the Nazis having super scientific science fiction weapons that they would have to blow up. Or they did a werewolf story once and all of that. So whereas DC tried to stay grounded in reality to an extent, Marvel just threw its World War II guys into the middle of a universe where super science and superheroes and supernatural threats all exist. And it worked in its own way. It's not in any way a criticism. It's two different ways of handling the comic book characters, both of which had their own great stories. I just wanted to give an example of one of the best Sgt Fury stories. This one from the early 70s, yeah, 73. In this one, it starts off with all the Howling Commandos except Sgt Fury getting killed. In recent years, it's become kind of a cliche that when somebody in a comic book gets killed, they'll somehow be brought back to life, and characters getting killed have lost dramatic impact because of that. It's actually something that's wrong with current comic book storytelling. But in the early 70s, that wasn't a cliche then. So you're reading this and you think all these guys that you've read about for years and liked are all of a sudden very abruptly dead. Now it turns out, and this was done in a way that it didn't seem cliched or poorly done. It really had emotional impact. It turns out that Fury had been captured by his archenemy, a German named Baron Strucker, and was being drugged and was hallucinating that all the other commandos had gotten killed. And at the end of the story, when Fury gets loose, he's completely broken. He sees his guys, he won't accept that they're alive. He thinks he's still being tortured by Strucker, by being shown images of his dead friends. And it is a comic book universe. In the next issue, the commandos have to rescue a Jewish psychiatrist from the Germans, who's the one guy that can cure Fury, and then he's back to normal 2 issues later. But while it lasted, this shows what the effect that war can have, even on the guy who's like the ultimate tough guy of World War II. Even he can break if enough pressure is put on him. Marvel never got into creating multiple characters for their World War II universe the way DC did. They did try a couple other books over the years. Captain Savage and his Leatherneck Raiders ran for a couple of years, starting in 1968. It was about a submarine captain who had actually guest starred several times in Sgt Fury, who's then given his own commando team. And you can see just how over the top these stories were. I don't think in real life riding surfboards ashore on a Japanese held island is really a tactically sound idea, but the image is cool. That did not catch on the way Sgt Fury did, and it was canceled after a relatively short run. They tried again in 1972 with a character named Combat Kelly, and in here they just directly ripped off the movie The Dirty Dozen, which was about an Army officer training convicts who had been convicted of various violent crimes to be a commando unit. The exact same thing happens here. Combat Kelly's given 12 guys who are all in prison for various violent crimes, actually 11 guys and a girl, and told to train them into a commando unit. And they actually did some really good stories, including this one here, about the dilemma of being commanded by an officer that you're legally bound to obey, but who is incompetent and whose orders are going to get your men killed. And what do you do in that situation? And it was handled really well. But the Combat Kelly book was also interesting in that over the course of its, I think, 12 issues before it was canceled, most of the original Deadly Dozen were killed one by one along the way. So you had a body count there. It was showing that the good guys don't always survive. And so that's it. The DC Comics and the Marvel Comics all had their own storytelling philosophy, but they all had great artists. They all had over-the-top action, but they all had these really human moments that said important things. So, you know, these comics, they existed mostly as an outlet to tell entertaining, exciting stories with often superb artwork. But they were more than that. The stories being told spoke to us about courage and duty and tragedy and heroism, protecting the innocent and fighting against evil. You know, in addition to the over-the-top action and the dinosaurs and the ghosts and the robots and the silly premises and the occasionally contrived plots, the war comics published by DC and Marvel had important things to say. And in the end, I think they really are a sincere tribute to a generation of men who in the 1940s quite literally marched to the front lines and saved the world. And that is it. Is there any questions and comments from anybody? Yes?
So how is the comic book industry doing these days?
Very, 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 very poorly. Despite the fact that the characters, because of the movies, are more popular than ever, comic books themselves are selling badly. And there's a lot of debate over why. I have my opinions. I think they tell stories poorly, and they do several other things that make people not want to buy them anymore. But the escapism is still there, but they're more expensive. Even taking inflation into account, they're more expensive. They're not the impulse buys they used to be. And they also have a bad habit of doing these major crossover stories where you can't buy just one title that you like. The story will cross over into like 4 or 5 other stories, and you have to spend $4 a pop for those issues to get the entire storyline. And I think the industry's kind of shooting itself in the foot by doing that.
The only place, you know, I mean, it's nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
But for instance, on The Big Bang Theory, they have this guy who's got the comic book store.
Yes, and that's, you know, there's comic book stores like that today. So the industry still exists. But the comic book store in Sarasota depends as much, maybe even more, on board games and graphic novel collections of stories rather than the individual comic books. In the 50s, when comic books were at their biggest, a popular comic could literally sell 1 million copies. Nowadays, I think if a particular copy sells 10 to 20,000 copies nationally, then they think it did well. But the industry is not anywhere near what it was. It's kind of ironic because of the successful movies. The characters are better known by the average person than they used to be, but no one's buying the comic books. And I think that several of their publishing and storytelling philosophies nowadays are just making it hard for new readers to jump in and making it expensive because of the number of books you have to buy for any one storyline. So that's my opinion. Other people have argued other reasons for that. But it's possible, both DC and Marvel are now owned by bigger corporations. It's possible that they may eventually close up shop of the comic book companies and just license the comic book rights out to other publishers. Marvel's already licensed Archie to do like little digest reprints of older superhero stories that they stock in grocery stores, the way they do with the Archie digests. So that's one possibility. Yes?
You said this, but I forgot. Did you say that Marvel Comics, they let what was the relationship between the art and the story, where the art was done first?
Oh, you would come up with the general plot.
Yeah.
And sometimes it was the artist coming up with the general plot, not and he would draw out the whole like 16, 24 pages of art, and then the writer would go in and fill in the dialogue. Right. So the artist had a lot more influence on the actual direction of the story than he would at other companies where he was just given a script and this is what you're drawing. So it's two different storytelling philosophies, but both companies did great stories, so they both work. Yeah. Yes?
You know, these comics to some extent have been resuscitated. Belgium and Holland
Mm-hmm.
in the late 90s, mid 2000s.
Okay.
So, but they have a different, there's no Pacific theater,
Yeah.
except for a few Dutch versions, but they tell more of a story. It's an integrated story, so
Yeah.
the book is pretty thick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, a lot.
It's the same kind of artwork
Mhm.
and similar character development. Although there's none of the fantasy or anything.
Yeah.
And it gives a different perspective because they're bringing in a perspective of the Low Countries.
Yeah. And I think I've read some of the European stuff. There's like some really important storytelling being done there.
Yeah, I think it's more storytelling.
Yeah. So, also Disney comics with characters like Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge are very, very popular, have been for decades in some places in Europe. So, so there's that too. So, any other questions or comments? Yes.
Are these always done in color?
Usually, yes. There was another company that did a black and white workbook called Blazing Combat, but DC and Marvel, they did do black and white books, but I don't recall them doing any of their war stories in that format. So at least if they did, it was rare.
Are there any current war comics?
Not that I'm aware of. They tried to bring the War That Time Forgot, DC did a few years ago when they did one of their reboots where they just restarted their universe, but I think it only lasted a few issues.
Formatting is so different nowadays.
It is, and they do digital coloring too, which is a matter of personal taste, but it looks different from from the hand coloring that used to take place.
They do comics about Vietnam.
There was, Marvel did a book that ran for a number of years in the 80s called Nam, which I've actually never gotten around to reading, but it's critically acclaimed. It apparently was really good and actually really realistic in how it presented that war. And the backup stories in the DC comics would occasionally deal with Vietnam.
Yeah.
I do remember several Vietnam stories. And they would occasionally do other wars. I remember one about the Zulu-British War, for instance. But generally, they would stick to World War II. I think you just had the appeal of definite good guys and bad guys, where you didn't often have that in other wars.
Was the genesis of these series actually from movies?
No, I think it was, well, of course, there were lots of war movies being made in the late 40s and 50s, so it's entirely possible the publishers looked at the success of those and say, let's do this.
Well, in
But
the 40s and 50s, most of them were still black and white.
Yeah, but I think a lot of it was they, aside from the good guy, bad guy automatic thing, I think at that time, the kids buying comics, their fathers would have been a part of World War II. So part of the appeal would they were reading about the war that their dads would have taken part in. So I think that was part of the appeal and probably part of the reason that they started publishing them. Yes.
Of course, my father wouldn't let me read them. So.
Oh well.
This is slightly askew with the topic, but I know that there is a difference, but I want your opinion. What is the difference between comic books and graphic novels?
Well, graphic novels usually, the comic book is the format it is, like a magazine. A graphic novel is an actual book, and often they are collections of something that was originally published as a comic, but they can also be original as well. So you get an actual hardbound or paperback thing that tells, in general, a single story over the course of however many pages it is.
Yeah, because I know that there is a difference, but when people who don't read them ask about it, I'm kind of like, well, I actually don't know how to explain this to you without it sounding like
it's also, I've never thought it was that important to try and pound out a difference, because they obviously influence each other, and often the graphic novels, especially the famous ones like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns were originally published as comics and then collected into graphic novels. I wish some of these war stories would be collected into graphic novels. You can get the Sgt Fury stuff, but DC seems to have largely forgotten about its war comics, and I would really wish they would start doing collections of them, because
these war stories have the Comics Code authority.
They did. If you
Marvel, when Harry Osborn went on drugs issues,
they had to print it without the comic codes thing.
Away from it,
yes, if you read some of the early Sgt Rock stuff, you notice in the stories that the fights with the Germans degenerate into fist fights rather than gunfights very often. And that was to keep the comic codes people happy, that they wouldn't violate those very strict rules of the comic code authority.
What you're seeing
but
there on
yeah,
that panel,
Yeah, as time went by, the comic code loosened up a little on some things. So for some years, they weren't doing horror comics anymore because the backlash against that was part of why a comic code existed. The comic code, by the way, was the industry's self-regulation that came into existence in the 50s when comics were getting bad publicity, and it was to regulate themselves so that the government wouldn't step in and do it. And they were very strict at first about violence and horror and drug use and all of that, often completely out of context with how it was being depicted. And over the years, they loosened up a little. So eventually you could get stuff like this and people recognize it's a war story, and that's a legitimate part of telling that story. So, any other questions? Yep, I will end with my shameless self-promotion page. These are my books, Radio by the Book about old-time radio, Storytelling in the Pulps, Comics and Radio, which is about early newspaper comic strips and also old-time radio and the pulp magazines from the first half of the 20th century. This week's double feature is just suggestions for family-friendly movies, not kid films, but movies that are okay for families to share with their kids. And my blog is comics, old-time radio, and other cool stuff. So that's where you can find more stuff by me if you're interested. So, okay, well, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you.